Hello YouTube! This video is actually a follow-up to my recent retrospective on a challenge run that I did, where I tried to use only the worst characters in Fire Emblem Engage. How we figured out what the worst characters were was we took 10 popular tier lists off of the internet and we averaged them out to get the tier list that you see in front of you. This one is not my tier list, don't worry, I know it's wacky. Basically, the goal of this video is going to be to discuss some of the problems with creating a Fire Emblem Engage tier list, or any Fire Emblem tier list in actuality, and then to create a tier list that should apply more accurately to casual and semi-casual players that don't really care about low turn count and just want some strong characters to beat the game with. Anyway, I hope you enjoy! So firstly, I want to mention tier lists in general in Fire Emblem. We love them. Everybody loves them. They're very popular content. However, I don't think the Fire Emblem community does tier lists very well. And the problems with tier lists in Fire Emblem, we've got different settings that people play on. There's a chunk of the community that's never played on anything but hard, never played on anything but casual. We've got traditional Fire Emblem players that play on like Maddening Classic, and that's the only way to play is on Classic, permadeath. We've got people who use rewinds, people who restart chapters still if a unit dies, people who always play Iron Man, people who play LTC. Different settings are just going to give you different results. Secondly, the LTC crowd, this is low turn count. These are the people who try to solve the game and try to figure out how to complete it in the least number of turns possible. This is a big, complicated math problem, but it seems like the LTC crowd believes that because a character is completely critical and crucial in an LTC strategy, that it is objectively a strong unit because of that. And this is just not true. My example for this is going to be Amber. We'll talk a little bit more about why I believe Amber is overrated in a later slide. Another problem with the tier list is that some players do not value investment or babying of a unit in the early game unless the payoff is very extreme. So we're talking the trainee characters. Some people just completely hate them, and other people find a lot of satisfaction in the zero to hero journey. You start with this character that's just completely useless at the beginning of the game, but by the end of the game, they're your strongest unit. I personally love the zero to hero journey. It's one of my favorite aspects of Fire Emblem, and I will always use at least one trainee unit. Now, another problem with tier lists is that many content creators try to rush out their tier lists because they want to put them out during the media frenzy for the game, because this is when it's going to have the most views, the most interactions, the most eyeballs on it. Unfortunately, a side effect of this is that they put out these tier lists without having put in the work. They'll play one or two runs and then they'll say, here's a tier list, this is how I think these characters stack up, and then they're going to try to like put in characters that they didn't even use in either of their runs and say, I feel like this character is maybe B tier. And then when somebody comes back and watches this tier list, they're getting, if they don't listen to all of the context, they're getting bad information. And unfortunately, by the time people have done adequate runs, adequate testing, the discussion on unit strength is basically complete. People have already come to their decisions. They will never accept anything else other than what everybody else said towards the beginning of the game's life cycle. At this point, I want to give some props to Iced Coffee Gaming. He gets a lot of flack. People call him a casual, yada yada. But his tier list, he has continually updated and changed his tier list of characters, and he has done extensive testing on many of the characters that people consider weak to show why they actually are really good. For instance, with Timerra, he showed that all you need to do to get her online is let her solo half of the Lindon chapter. And she's really good at it. I did it in my run. Just gave her a Javelin and Ike and sent her down the left side. It was really good. It was really strong, and then she carried my run after that. Unfortunately, most tier lists have Timerra at a F tier, D tier towards the bottom, and Iced Coffee did put her in an S tier. I don't necessarily agree with that. We'll get into that when I fix the tier list. But, you know, props to him for actually putting in the work, trying out all of the builds, doing multiple Maddening runs before, well, not before putting out the tier list, but updating the tier list after the fact. Not a lot of people do that. Now, another issue with tier lists is that most of the people who aggressively participate in the unit discussions tend to be a vocal minority of players. These are kind of efficiency and LTC players. They're the ones who are going to be sitting there arguing about what characters are good, what characters are bad, and unfortunately they tend to be a little bit aggressive. The last thing I want to talk about is just that places like Reddit are kind of an echo chamber. Everybody just says the popular opinion to get updates, and anyone who has a diverging opinion from the core crowd of Terminally Online people will get downvoted to oblivion and pretty toxic responses before that. This is a unfortunate truth of Reddit especially. If you are trying to have real conversation about Fire Emblem units, I do find that Serenus Forest and GameFAQs are a little bit more welcoming, and also that you might want to just go into like a content creator's Discord or something, because there's a lot of really cool people in there that'll just like try to min-max the worst character in the game with you. Here's the most controversial part of the video probably. I'm gonna fix the tier list, and this is from a semi-casual perspective. I do believe that my tier list will be more useful than a lot of the other tier lists out there for specifically the casual players and the semi-casual players that don't really care about the turn counts at all. They just want strong characters, they want to get through the game, and they want to complete it. So my ranking is based on the following considerations. Maddening, no paid DLC, not an Iron Man, but preferring to avoid rewinds. I'm a classic Fire Emblem player. I used to reset my saves every time a character I cared about died. I'm sure a lot of us did. I'm focused on a versatile playstyle. I consider both offensive and defensive strategies viable. You can blast through the map and clear it, sure, but you could also turtle your way through the map. You could do bait and switch strategies with the general. I find all of this to be viable, and I am considering all of these playstyles with my tiering. Resources are used to maximize the performance of the whole team rather than a few juggernauts. I want my whole team contributing because that's how I like to play. Routing maps and reinforcements is how we're getting experience. We're not doing any grindy exploits. Shout out to Excelblem and his level 20 Framme on chapter 4. We're not doing that. We are acknowledging that Mercurius and Great Sacrifice exist as ways to level up early game units. I do not believe it's an exploit to set up your team in a way that they've all taken damage so you could do a nice big Great Sacrifice. You could do this throughout the course of a chapter and still get 2 or 3 Great Sacrifices off with normal play. This is not an exploit. You can also use Bond Fragments to get someone to rank 10 with Marth and get Mercurius, and you could get some EXP from kills, no problem. My tiering is weighted more towards mid to late game stats and performance. This is because no matter who you use, the beginning game, probably all the way up to the Solm chapters, are actually pretty easy. Chapters 1 through 5 are almost completely solved at this point, and then no matter who you use, 6 through 11 are going to be pretty straightforward. In 11, all you got to do is make sure that you've already promoted a Lear and run her straight down the middle. If she still has 4 move, you're going to have a bad time. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's get into the tier list and why I put some people where I did. I am going to have a few examples, a few stats that I'm going to put up on the screen, probably right here above me, for a couple of the discussions. S tier, I think S tier is fine. You've got your Kagetsu, who is the most broken character in the game. You've got your Dancer. You've got Bunet, who with a Vantage Wrath setup can solo a majority of the game. And then you've got your high build mages. res stats are extremely low in this game. Mages do extremely high damage to almost all enemies. Even some of the higher res enemies don't necessarily have enough res to completely mitigate magic damage. It's kind of crazy. You could still kill a flyer with Bolganone. Hortensia is a flying cleric that gets you extra uses of staves, and she's actually pretty competent with Elfire. She doesn't have a very high tome proficiency, but she has an incredible speed stat, and she'll almost always double and has a pretty good magic stat too. So give her Elfire, temper it up, and she's actually going to do a good amount of damage. Alir, force deploy, so obviously she's S tier. I like to play crit builds on Alir. Some people like to do support builds. No matter what you do, she's going to be really competent at it, unless you're trying to like turn her into a sage. But hey, maybe that would even work. She does technically have a magic growth. Marin is basically Kagetsu 2.0, but you get her later. And then A tier, this is where I said the previous list fell apart. Up at the top, we've of course got Chloe. I've also got Timerra right next to her. I believe that these two characters can carry a game equally well with varied levels of investment. Chloe does need more investment to come online, but she is a flyer and available for more of the game. Therefore, I put her slightly higher. Timerra, basically all you have to do is give her Ike and a Javelin and send her through the Lin paralog once you've got her in Picket. She will level up to the point where she can get Sandstorm and then just basically steamroll the whole thing. Yunaka, I think she is a better thief than Zelkov. Not only does she on average have better stats than Zelkov in relevant areas, such as resistance, for instance, resistance and speed especially. Thieves like to hang out in evade tiles, and mages are the only thing that's going to have really good accuracy against them. So a higher res is a lot better than a higher defense, which you get with Zelkov. I'm going to put a comparison of their growths right above me, so you can see for yourself. Yunaka's just, in my opinion, got better stats for a thief. She also crits more often when she is in an evade tile. You want to have your thieves in evade tiles anyway. This is great for her. Obviously, it's useless if you don't have evade tiles. But she's still pretty competent with a dagger regardless. Alright, now we've got your mage characters. These are the low build mage characters. All four of them are definitely A tier because mages are really strong in this game. Like I said, the res stats are very low on enemies, so any magic-based damage dealer is going to have a good time. The first points of contention, I kind of went back and forth on this one, Ana versus Veyle. So Veyle is a force deploy basically because she's one of the only viable units that you could put in your 13th or 14th deployment slots. But even if we're not factoring that, she's a competent unit. I'm gonna put the stats for a internal level 34 Veyle, aka when you get her, and an internal level 34 Ana that leveled up to 10 in Axe Fighter, reclassed into Sage, and then reclassed back into Sage. I'm going to put those stats above me here. And then I'm also going to put their growths here. As you saw, Veyle is a little bit stronger than Veyle at that internal level. Even if you give Veyle some bonus stats by putting her into Sage, because her current class, her like default class has pretty terrible bases, so you could get some free stats. Ana's still ahead of her. So Ana can't use Obscurite, sadly, but she still can use all of the other tomes. Now the next point of contention is going to be Jean versus Citrinne. Now, I'm considering Jean a mage because if you take a look at his growths in his base class here, you'll see that he's pretty much set to be a magic user if you just level him up in his base class with staves. And this is the path of least resistance. Now, if you do go the path of least resistance, once he is promoted, you can then turn around and reclass him over to Sage. If you reclass Jean into Sage, him and Citrinne actually have relatively comparable growths, with Jean taking the lead in every single stat. See here. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that he's immediately better than Citrinne. I'm going to put some points of comparison right here. Now, as you can see, when you initially reclass Citrinne, she is going to have about a +2 lead in relevant stats compared to Jean at that same internal level. But by the time they gain 20 levels in Sage, Jean will have taken the lead in speed, dexterity, defense, etc., while being exactly equal in magic. This means that Jean is basically a Citrinne that starts in a healing class and is relevant throughout the entire game. Their personal skills don't even come into consideration here. A lot of people would say, well, Jean doesn't have a personal skill because his personal skill is to have better growths. And I would say Citrinne doesn't have a personal skill because her personal skill is to heal other people nearby when she uses a healing item. How often are you really using that? That said, even if I wanted to put Citrinne above Jean, I cannot do that because Jean has another feature, and that's that he is completely versatile. If you really wanted to, you can have an incredible insert any class here just by reclassing him at level 1 with a second seal and then leveling him up with Micaiah. This does mean you're leveling him up from 1 on starting on chapter 8, unless you got really lucky with the well and got a second seal from one of the first well procs. It is possible without any exploits to get him relatively high level from chapter 8 just by gaining him several levels in chapters 9 and 10, and then hopefully by the end of 11 he'll be a level 9 or 10 and you can then promote him. The preferred classes to put him in, if you want to put him in any other martial class, is going to be Axe Fighter or Sword Fighter. Or Armor Knight if you really wanted to have like a tanky Jean. Reasons for this is because since he doubles his class growths, an Axe Fighter is going to have, I believe, 100% HP growth all the way through those 10 levels, and a really high strength growth. A Sword Fighter is obviously going to have the really high speed growth, especially when you combine it with his already okay speed growth. And a Armor Knight is going to have an incredible defense growth. And an Armor Knight is extremely easy to level with Micaiah because you don't even need to get your units hit first. Just use Great Sacrifice and send him to every emblem energy, use Great Sacrifice every time you get to it, and you'll have a level 10 Armor Knight Jean in no time. That said, I still think Path of Least Resistance is his base class, and so comparing him directly to Citrinne is preferable. You could also compare him to Framme. He is a superior martial master. You could compare him to Pandreo. I do think that while Jean will have decent stats in High Priest, Pandreo will have him beat just because of his build. Moving on, we've got Framme. Framme is your first healer. She's a good healer. She has one of the highest speed growths in the game. You could turn her into a really good Pegasus. You could turn her into a really good Martial Master. Framme's not as good as a Martial Master as Chloe is, because Chloe can get some flat damage for free, but she's still very competent in the role. You can also put her into a few other classes, magic-based classes, or even strength-based classes. Her speed will carry her through whatever class you put her in. She does have incredibly low build and zero growth in build, so that is something to keep in mind. You probably want her to be using swords or fists, but I digress. Next we have on B tier. I tried to keep the tiering relatively in the power level of the original list. So like, I just moved outliers in the groups to a different tier. basically. At the top of the list here, we have Diamant, Louis, and Lapis. These three I put at roughly the same tier because they are really good at one thing and one thing alone, and that is baiting units to attack them. Diamant is a pretty good enemy phase character. His personal basically equates to some extra evade. He takes 3 hits, he gets a soul proc, he basically nullified one of those hits. So he's a pretty good character for baiting out attacks. Louis is pretty good at baiting out attacks. He's never going to have the same speed as the other two, so he gets doubled more often. But as long as you don't put him in range of a hammer or a magic user, he should be pretty okay. Lapis is a great evade tank. She gets extra avoid even from her ability, so she's even better of an evade tank than she would be just factoring in her high speed. The one thing holding her back, I think, is that she also reduces her own crit when she's near allies, and swords generally rely on crit to do damage, I feel like. But that said, you could do some stuff with Lapis, like using Erica for some extra flat damage, using sword power to basically nullify her personal and get her some extra damage. There's a few things you could do with her. She's always going to have really high speed, and yeah, I think she's still a really good unit. I would not put her at the bottom tiers. Next we have what I like to call the group of archers. I think all 4 of these characters are really close to each other in power. Obviously, Fogado is at the front of these characters because he requires the least investment to get online. He's just a really good archer. He has pretty high speed. His strength leaves a lot to be desired, but at least he'll be doubling pretty frequently without much assistance. So you can focus on getting his might up rather than trying to patch his speed. Alcryst, kind of the same thing. He's going to struggle to keep up in his might, but his personal makes up for that a little bit, and his speed and dex are really good. Etie, I would say, is only slightly worse than Alcryst. They both do the same job. They'll both one-shot flyers. But really, the conversation here is between Etie and Amber. Amber is highly overrated to me. He has almost the exact same growths as Etie. He just comes in later and has a better strength base. But if you look at the 2 characters, I'm going to put their stats in Warrior at internal level 28 right here. As you can see, the differences between the 2 characters are relatively negligible. Etie has a little bit less strength, a little bit more speed, and a notably less survivability. Whereas Amber will have a bit more survivability. If you wanted to put him into Warrior, he would probably be more focused on melee rather than using bows because he's also locked into the steel bow. Now, where this conversation gets a little bit more interesting is if you look at Sniper Amber or Bow Knight Amber and maybe compare them to Warrior Etie and Alcryst. Take a look here. Sniper Amber seems like a middle ground between the 2. If you want someone who has less hit problems than Etie, you'll still need to patch his speed significantly with Lynn and inheriting speed +5. But the trade-off here is that he has less strength, but he can still use a silver bow. He is a covert rather than a backup if you wanted to have a covert effect on your team. And I would say he is like a Alcryst that doesn't rely on his Luna procs maybe, and also needs help with speed. But he's going to hit a lot more because his dex is higher in Sniper, and he's also got a personal that's helping his hit even more if he's attacking a lone unit. And let's be honest, flyers seem to just like go where they want, and they're rarely next to another unit. But since Amber's stats are so close to Etie's, I would not feel comfortable putting him in A rank. Rounding out the B tier, we've got Zelkov. As I discussed, Yunaka is a better character than Zelkov when it comes to just being a thief. The things that you want a thief to do, I feel like Yunaka does it better. That said, Zelkov is a good thief as well. I've used him several times, and each time I always wished he was Yunaka. Coming down to C tier, these characters are mostly all characters that can function as things, but they'll struggle compared to the people on the tiers above them. So, for instance, Mauvier, Goldmary, Alfred, Jade, they can function as frontline tanks. However, they're gonna take more damage and be less survivable than someone like Diamant, Louis, or Lapis. By that same token, Clanne, Clanne is extremely high investment if you want to put him into a martial class. Like I said with Jean, you can wait until about Chapter 8, second seal a level 1 Clanne into either Sword Fighter or Axe Fighter. I'll put the growths that he has in those two classes here. And then I'll put the stats that he has when he reclasses into a hero or a warrior here. So as you can see, he's pretty useful, but yeah, it just sucks that he starts in Mage because his stats in Mage just don't make sense, right? It seems like they meant for him to be your Mage Knight, but even then, I feel like other characters are just better Mage Knights than him. And suffering from the hybrid stat problem, we've got Celine. Celine's stats are just never going to be comparable to most of the other characters that you have in a mage class. The best thing that Celine has going for her is her unique class. It's really cool. Her sword crits are awesome. It reminds me of something from like Ruby, with the jumping off of the rune to do the sword strike. Super cool. Definitely recommend checking out her class's sword crit animation if you haven't. But that said, it's really hard to make her work unless she's stat blessed. She will perform in doing magic damage. She has some really good gimmick builds with staves because she has such an extremely high luck. You could also give her Divine Pulse. She'll literally never miss anything ever if you give her Divine Pulse Plus, which is good because Byleth is pretty good on a Mystic unit, as they will have the Thyrsus from 3 houses that gives a mage some extra range. And then you can use, I don't know, you could use like an L Surge at 3 range, or get like those 5 range Thorons. But even then, I just feel like someone like Anna or Pandreo would be better suited to using the Byleth emblem. Alfred, he gets a lot of flack. He's a pretty good unit overall, but he requires a lot of investment, and he just ends up being kind of on par with some of the B tier units, with a worse skill in his personal class. And he is very easily stat screwed if you're playing on random growths. Kind of a mixed bag for me. I've had a lot of runs where Alfred was one of the strongest people on my team. I've also had a lot of runs where he gets screwed in one stat and just becomes completely worthless because of that. I'm not sure what it is about him, but it seems like it's really easy for one stat to just get screwed and then his whole character just falls apart. For that reason, I've got him pretty low. But if you want to use Alfred, his growths are phenomenal in his default class. Avenir gets a lot of flack for being bad because it has a bad skill, which basically, it's kind of like Soul. It's random proc, it has a chance to reduce damage. It might as well just be some extra avoid. If you're playing with DLC, he becomes much better because Hector on Avenir is really fun. He doesn't get the crit that a backup unit like Diamant would get, but it does help him with his bad speed because he'll have a quick riposte, and also the Hector ultimate where he becomes tanky gets ignored by most units in Maddening, but he'll at least double them if they do attack them. Yeah, Jade, basically just a worse Louis. Her stats will always be lower than Louis in almost every relevant stat. Boucheron, unfortunately, he has a really good build, a really good speed growth, decent dex growth, but that 20% strength growth holds him back so much. My Boucheron in this run did get really strength blessed, and I don't know how it happened. He had one of the highest strength stats on my entire team. Good for him. But that's not normal. D tier, Lindon, his offensive stats are just way too low. I did kind of get him working in kind of a meme build with Sniper and Micaiah. He also has some Dire Thunder builds that are kind of meme worthy. I think I've seen someone put him in Mage Knight or Royal Knight and using a Killer Lance. At the end of the day, his builds are all kind of memes. They're not the strongest things you're going to have on your team, but they are pretty fun. I'm not ranking characters on fun. If I was, Lindon would be higher, but as it stands, his stats are just not on par with the other characters in the lineup. Saphir, you can make her into a Vantage Wrath character. It's gonna miss one-shot thresholds on almost everything in Maddening, especially at the points in the game that you get her. She is extremely competent on hard, but again, I'm not rating this on hard. Rosado seems like he should have come earlier in the game. He's got really good growths, but really bad bases. I swear that he should have been swapped with Kagetsu. You should have gotten Kagetsu in Rosado's join chapter, and Rosado in Kagetsu's join chapter. It would have made so much more sense. Kagetsu's got high bases and high growth, to be fair. But Rosado's just got low bases, high growths. He makes more sense in the beginning of the game. Vander is probably one of the worst Jagan characters that I've seen, while also being one of the best Jagan characters that I've seen. In chapters 1 through 4, he sets up kills almost too perfectly for Alir, Clanne, and sometimes even Framme if you wanted to get them some kills. But at the same time, you don't have to do it. You could get through the first chapter in Maddening just by parking Alir in a bush and moving Vander out of the way. More often than not, Alir will be fine, and you might have to eat a healing item or two, but you can feed all of that EXP just to Alir. Same thing on chapters 3 and 4. He is pretty good on chapter 2, but again, you still don't have to use him. So while I do appreciate that he's there, he doesn't have any way to scale into the late game, not like some of the better Jagans in history, like Titania or Seth. So if he's not necessary in the early game, and he doesn't scale into the late game, I don't see any way to rank him higher than the bottom of the list. He could just not exist and the game would be fine. Or at least I would rate Vander the worst if Bunet didn't exist. He has a terrible personal skill, an excellent voice actor, and yeah, his bases are very confusing. For reference, I'm going to put the stats of what a instantly reclassed Bunet looks like if he reclasses into Paladin, which is Vander's class. Then I'm going to put Vander's stats right here. Yeah, so Bunet, his growths aren't much better either. Let's take a look at his growths in Paladin compared to Vander's growths in Paladin. And this is a character that you get in chapter 13 for some reason. Not a lot else to say there. I'm sure Bunet is fine once you hit stat caps, but until that point, like if you're grinding out the end game for some reason rather than just restarting every time you finish Sombron. Um, yeah, maybe Bunet comes into play there. But in general gameplay, I just don't see Bunet being valuable.